This presentation provides results of a study at Sunrise Park and Beach that focuses on beach erosion. This study is an outgrowth from erosion that has occurred at Sunrise Beach. Lake levels have been high since 2014. Increased wave energy can result closer to shore, and this has triggered erosion. History tells us that high lake levels occur about as frequently as low lake levels, and if unchecked, losses of beach and tableland can occur. Sunrise Beach is showing symptoms of erosion that are relatively significant. The beach is a major asset to the community, therefore, the community decided to initiate this study to look for solutions to preserve the beach and to develop prevention measures for the future. This photograph taken at the south side of the central beach illustrates the type of erosion that I'm referring to. As you can see, the erosion extends into the upper reaches of the beach, and the clay that underlies the sand has been exposed. And as I'll explain later on in the presentation, the preservation of the existing natural clays is very important to the future health of the beach. This picture is also of the north side of the central beach and is a close-up of the clay erosion that is occurring. This slide is an illustration of the erosion process at a beach. The upper right-hand illustration shows normal storm conditions when wave energy is not so intense. The sand layer will move onshore and offshore depending on the type of energy coming in with this wave action. So there's no permanent loss in beach during this type of a condition. The lower slide shows a storm condition. And during this condition, a good portion of the sand can be lost offshore. And the wave action, which is more intense, can then erode the underlying native clay materials. These are very stiff clay materials when in place by nature, having been compressed by the glaciers. But once they erode, they break down into very small particles that float offshore. And as a result, you lose the underlying support for the sand layers above, and essentially you lose a significant portion of your beach. And this is how the erosion can progress. This study begins with a history of the beach, and it includes the original conditions before any construction was accomplished and the gradual build out of the various features of the beach. The report then goes into an evaluation of the existing site condition in terms of its equilibrium positions, the reasons why erosion is occurring, the types of structures that are helping to support the beach, and where the weaknesses are. We then performed a site plan analysis to identify options for improvements to the beach, construction items that could be put in place that would help the beach to hold sand and to reduce the potential for erosion. We will begin the presentation with a discussion of historic beach and bluff damages. This picture illustrates erosion on the central beach by the restroom guard building. The picture is taken looking to the north, and you can see that the beach is essentially completely eroded around the structure. This is a picture of the same area, only looking from north of the building to the south. Again, you can see the significant erosion damage. These are pictures of the central beach illustrating the evolution of construction in this area. The upper left picture shows in 1976 the construction of the original steel groin, which was 188 feet offshore. The picture in the upper right illustrates current conditions in the cell and includes the stone structure that's pointed out, which was constructed in the year 2000. And as you can see, landward of that structure, there's significant sand that deposits in that area as a result of that structure being present. The picture on the bottom of the slide illustrates the steel groin in the middle of Central Beach, and it shows how part of that groin has been exposed due to erosion on the land side end of it. This photograph was taken in the early 1970s of the area located to the north of the Dog Beach. And you can see the extensive erosion of the bluffs and the shoreline, as well as the downed trees as a result of the erosion. These recent photographs of the area north of the Dog Beach show armorstone revetment work that was completed in 1988 to protect the area of the bluff that had failed, as shown in the prior picture. These pictures of the South Beach illustrate conditions in the 1970s when the bluff had completely failed. This is the area due south of the North Shore Water Reclamation District facility. This is a recent picture of the same area at South Beach, showing the structures that were put in place in the past in 1991 that have stabilized this area, although there is erosion going on and the beach is extremely narrow for a good part of this beach. The next group of slides that I'm going to show include recent damages that have occurred at the beach during the high lake levels and wave activity in the past couple of years. This picture is taken at the south end of the Central Beach, and it's a close-up of the erosion that has occurred, and it's removed much of the sand down to the clay, and you can see the steep erosion feature is a signature of when you have clay erosion. Sand erosion tends to be a much more gradual shape to it. This picture was recently taken at the south end of the Central Beach, looking to the north, and you can see that the sand has eroded to the point where the old gravel maintenance road is exposed. This road is normally covered in sand, and the erosion's getting down to the clay that exists beneath that road. These are photographs of the North Beach, known as the Dog Beach. And as you can see, much of the sand is gone. The sand is dominated more by cobbles. And on the very north end of the Dog Beach, you can see that it's entirely all very large cobbles and old concrete rubble. There's also a pile of concrete rubble on the shoreline, which is somewhat dangerous in terms of steel rods sticking out of it and the danger of children climbing on this. Next, I have a couple of photographs of erosion damage nearby within Lake Bluff and Lake Forest. This particular slide is a very high bluff where the beach is almost entirely gone. And with the high lake levels, much larger waves can attack the toe of these bluffs, and you can see the erosion features at the toe. And once you lose those stiff clays, you'll have a series of landslides that keep forming this erosion feature, and the landmass will march to the west as land is lost to erosion. This is a property in Lake Bluff that has high bluffs adjacent to the water's edge. At this particular site, you can see on the left there's a failing walkway, and a picture taken about a year after that. You can see that walkway is gone and the erosion had progressed another 5 or 10 feet. At this particular site, we've seen 20 feet of land loss, both shoreline and tableland as well as beach, in a 2-year period. There are sites in many of the North Shore communities, for example, up in Lake Forest and even down in Evanston, where we've seen up to 200 feet of land loss over a 100-year period of time. So the erosion is significant, and without protection will continue. The next series of slides will address the various factors that influence the type and rates of erosion that can occur. So I'll present this information to give you a better feeling for why erosion occurs, and this gives us insight to things we can do to mitigate and prevent erosion in the future. Lake levels are an important stress factor when it comes to lake erosion. This is a chart of 100 years of lake level records. The blue line is the elevation of the lake above and below normal, which is shown as the red line. The lake tends to fluctuate between high and low. There's a 6-foot difference in lake level. The record high occurred in 1986, and we're actually very close to that, within inches at the present. You can see the yellow bars here are periods of high lake levels, and there's almost as many of those as black space, showing that we have the high levels almost as much as the lower levels. Another key stressor for beach erosion is storm surge. This is a graph of a significant storm event that happened in October of 2014. It was a 24-hour windstorm. The winds were coming out of the northeast, originating up in Wisconsin, and the winds act on the water all the way down to Lake Bluff, a significant distance. The longer that distance, the greater the storm surge. So in this case, you can see that the level of the lake tilted up. Took it about 8 or 9 hours by a difference of 2.5 feet above the normal level without the wind blowing. This is a significant factor because the deeper the water is approaching the beach, the greater the wave height that can be supported in that water. And at some point, the waves become so large that they trip themselves up and they will crash on themselves. And that's where you see the wave breaking occurring offshore. So during a storm like this, you might have 20 to 24 foot waves out in the deep water. And those waves approaching from the north are approaching on a lake level that is 2.5 feet higher than what it was without the wind blowing. So those big waves can be supported in the water much closer to shore than they would otherwise. And as such, the wave energy that is attacking the beach is just dramatically larger. This slide is a reminder in cross-section view of what the wave looks like as it's approaching shore. And in the case of a storm event, the waves start to break at some point when the water gets more and more shallow. So the deeper the water level is during a storm event, the larger the wave that can get in here. And as a result, the energy of the waves attacking the beach tend to erode the beach more quickly during a storm event. When a beach forms, there's usually a pretty good reason for it. The dynamics of water flow and wave action and storm surge, as well as the character of the soil along the shoreline on the lake bed, can all have an influence on the shoreline in terms of its rate of erosion, as well as its ability to hold sand. So one key factor to keep in mind for the Lake Bluff area and the North Shore in general is most of the shoreline is comprised of glacially placed soils that were deposited a long time ago. They're comprised primarily of clay, and there's a good amount of cobbles in that clay and small stone. As well, there are sand seams in the Lake Bluff area. Lake Forest, there tends to be a sand seam about 15 to 30 feet down from the tableland, from the top of the slopes. And those sand seams can be about 1 foot thick. In places they're 10 or 15 feet thick, but usually they're pretty thin. So the materials of the shoreline essentially, when there's erosion, they end up in the water and they become the supply of material for the beaches and for the littoral drift. So let's talk about littoral drift a little bit because it's important in terms of how beaches form. This aerial photograph shows that in Lake Bluff, the distance that wind can travel on the water is longest from the north. And that distance is what drives currents along the shoreline as well as wave action. So the longer distance that the winds travel on the water, the greater the wave heights, as well as the more significant the currents that are occurring along the shoreline. As you can see in Lake Bluff, that the distance the wind travels on the water from the south is much shorter than what happens from the north and northeast. As well, the predominant winds are faster, tend to be faster and more frequent from the north. As a result, most of the damaging waves are approaching from the north and northeast, and the more significant currents along the shore are also coming from the north. As an example, the largest waves that we tend to see in the historic record from the north can exceed 30 feet out in deep water, where the water's deep enough so the waves aren't breaking. Whereas coming from the south, you're more likely to see 7 or 8 foot waves approaching shore, and maybe 10 or 12 foot waves offshore in the deep water. And same thing from the east. The waves are maybe 7 or 8 foot waves coming out of the east. So most of the currents and the wave attack and erosion is induced by winds that are coming from the north, traveling long distances on the water. This causes bigger storm surge, which is the setup of the lake level in the direction of the wind, and makes for the ability of larger waves to get into shore. So the littoral currents are important to beach formation, and this is essentially the movement of water along the shore driven by the winds and waves. And those currents and the movement of the water along the shore creates an energy in the moving water that allows it to carry a certain amount of sand as it's traveling along the shore. So that is termed littoral drift. Essentially, it's a river of sand and other materials flowing along the shoreline in the predominant direction of the winds, and in the shallow water where the currents are faster, because in the deeper water the currents are much slower. The bottom of the lake doesn't feel that stress, but as soon as you get close to shore, the movement of the water creates a stress, and the water has the ability to carry sediment, and it does. It gets into an equilibrium where the amount of energy available in the water due to the currents is carrying as much sand as the currents can physically carry. This is an important factor because when you build a structure, or if there's a natural structure that juts out into the lake, it alters the ability of the littoral currents near shore to carry sand and sediment. As those currents are deflected out into deeper water by a structure, the velocity of the travel of that current slows down, and can slow down to a point where it can no longer carry sediment, or the amount of sediment that can be carried is reduced. And this is the phenomenon that influences how beach formation occurs in Lake Bluff. Another factor is the character of the sediment in the water. We don't have a lot of sand, natural sand, present in the environment in the North Shore because of the clay bluffs. So when a bluff erodes, the clay goes into the water and it breaks down to very small particles and floats offshore. So it's not really part of the sediment supply. There is some sand, as I indicated, in the seams, as well as eroding ravines are a significant influence in the Lake Bluff area. And most of those ravines are in an eroding condition because they're so steep and trying to get to equilibrium over many, many years. So as those ravines erode, and that eroded material is carried by the currents to Lake Michigan, the clay particles float offshore and the sands and the cobblestones stay near shore. And this is why in Lake Bluff you see a lot of beaches can have a lot of cobblestones on them, especially during periods following significant rainstorms where a lot of cobbles are washing out into the lake from the ravines. This slide now zooms in a little bit closer to Lake Bluff to show locally what can happen to the littoral drift, this river of sand and sediment that's flowing primarily from north to south. And so to the north of us, we have the Great Lakes Naval Station Harbor, which has been there for many, many years, 100 years or so. And when this harbor was first built, the river of sand that was trending along the shoreline, coming to the south, was interrupted. And that current was pushed offshore into deep water. And once it got into deep water, the velocity of movement of the current slows down dramatically so that it's more of a perfusion. So it no longer has the ability to carry sand. It doesn't have the energy because it's moving slow. So the sand would drop out in the deep water. And conversely, during currents coming from the east, a lot of that sand would end up getting actually pushed into the harbor. So proceeding to the south, the littoral currents in this area are relatively clean. There's very little sediment in the water back in the day when this harbor went in. And as a result, the water had the ability to carry more sand than it had in the current. So what happens is you tend to see an acceleration of erosion near shore as that water is eroding materials to get back into equilibrium. And once it has that equilibrium established, then the littoral currents continue without a lot of erosion occurring beyond the normal amounts. So the bottom line is that when you put structures in the water, you can influence the regional condition of the river of sand traveling along the shore. So when we look at how a beach is formed, it's important to understand how that's happening. Why is the sand depositing in some places and not in others? As well, when you build a structure or you modify a structure, the governmental agencies don't allow you to do it in a way that you are taking sand out of the environment. So if you're creating a potential for sand to form a larger beach to protect an eroding shoreline area, you have to pre-nourish the structure with sand. So you have to bring sand in from a quarry and place that sand in the water as part of the construction so that you're not affecting neighbors north and south of you. So now as we focus in on Sunrise Beach and Lake Bluff, we could talk about how these beach cells are forming. Why is the sand depositing here? And again, the predominant direction of the wind and littoral currents is coming from the right side of the screen, from the north. And when it arrives to Lake Forest Beach, so you can see here we have a beach formation. The sand is deposited here. And it tends to deposit, if you draw a perpendicular line, that's the mean energy of all wave and current activity coming in this particular beach zone. And the beach always forms perpendicular to that line. So the predominant currents coming in this direction the currents tend to separate and do a circular diversion here. So you get a relative quiet space in here, and that's why the sand will drop out in front of these structures, this impermeable steel wall that's in here, and this breakwater is causing this beach to form over the time. This part of the breakwater, in turn, has caused this beach formation in here. And that's, again, because of the currents. First of all, the direct wave attack coming in here is sheltered away from the position of the beach here. As well, the currents that are coming by are, again, reversing themselves, and they're relatively quiet back here. So that's what's causing this beach to form. Here you don't see as much of an influence from this structure because it's a low profile, so the waves, first of all, this is a wide gap, so the waves can get right in here. A lot of them, the energy comes right over the top of this structure. So this beach has not grown as much as it might have otherwise, just because of the nature. And then this stone structure out here is so small. This apparently was a little extra stone they had when they had built this structure to the north. It's really not having much of an influence, although you can see the beach is kind of bumped out just a little bit. That's because of this little bit of structure here, stone in the water. And this is such a wide gap in here that there's a lot of energy in here. So while there was obviously a beach that is formed in here to a certain extent, because of this structure and this steel in here, the growth is limited to where it's at. And right now there's exposed clay in here with the high lake levels and the fact that we can get waves coming in here pretty much unobstructed is what's causing the erosion. This part of the structure down here is all stone, so you don't really see beach erosion because there's no beach there to begin with. We do have overtopping water because the structure is not high enough, so this parking lot gets damaged. We see overtopping here, so this beach tends to erode in this area. And then this, the width, the gap at this structure is so wide that waves approaching from the north, and these tend to refract towards shore, towards shallow water, has direct access into this cell. And in certain respects, it's actually causing stress in here because so much of this energy is coming in as well as reflecting in. So that combined energy makes it very difficult for the sand to grow in this area at all. This structure here, this breakwater is fairly sizable, and that's why you see a pretty good beach formation behind it in this area. Because a lot of that wave attack, the big waves from the north are getting diverted, and it's just not getting into that area. It's relatively quiet, so the sand tends to drop out. So that's the reason this beach is formed the way it has. So the structures that are there, they're really a good skeleton of a structure, a good starting point. It's done a pretty good job of solving some of the bluff erosion problems that have happened historically. But we are seeing some loss of beach, and as we've indicated, some of that erosion is down into the native clays, which ends up becoming more of a permanent reduction over time of the width of these beaches. So the proposed options that we're looking into are to address those problems and to maintain the health of this beach going forward. This is, again, an aerial photograph of the existing beach condition as it was in 2017. So as we start to look at this beach and decide, what can we do to resolve some of the problem areas? So first of all, we know that we're having erosion problems on a good part of this beach here. We know that there's very little beach formation here, and we want to maintain the stability of the bluff here. So we want to do something to add some beach here and relatively shallow water so that the waves that do get in here can spend their energy as well. This is 250-foot wide gap. It's such a wide gap. We want to do something to reduce that, to knock down the wave energy. And not only that, but to stop this feature here where these waves come in and reflect off of this structure in addition to the waves that are coming in directly. So you're getting kind of a doubling of the influence in this area of erosion. So we're looking for a way to address this and get some of this wave energy out of here. We know we have problems in here from waves coming over the top of these structures. So we want to address that. This large erosion area in the central beach is due to these very large 140 to 210 foot wide gaps between structures, and they're thin, relatively low structures, so they're having some beneficial effect, but not as much as they could. And then at the Dog Beach, same thing. We have erosion in here, very poor sand quality. It's more heavy cobbles, extremely wide gap, allowing a lot of energy in here. So looking for ways to reduce the amount of energy that can get in there to improve the beach condition and reduce the erosion that's occurring in here. And then, of course, we have a rubble pile here that we want to address as part of the project. This slide is the same 2017 aerial photograph, and we've annotated on here 3 lines. The red line is the beach position historically during high water, like we're having at present and we had back in the late 80s. The yellow line is the average conditions that we've seen in the last 100 years or so, and the blue line is the position of the beach at low water. So this is reflecting the statistics of the last 100 years. As we go forward and the beach experiences erosion, these three lines will all migrate toward shore, closer to shore. But depending on the water level, what you actually see on the beach in terms of the position of the water will vary depending upon the elevation of the water. So it's just a simple representation of historically how has this beach looked for different lake levels. Again, in keeping in mind, this is not a snapshot for the future. The future will be different as erosion occurs. All these lines start to migrate to the west. The next phase of the project was to develop options to address the issues identified for Sunrise Beach. We did this by looking at several alternatives. The first is called the base option, and this option pretty much focuses just on the areas of need. The second option is called the expanded base option, and that option addresses additional items that would be a great addition to the park, but not necessarily something that has to be done to solve problems. And then a third option was explored as a potential collaborative effort with the North Shore Water Reclamation District for a project that they're anticipating occurring in the future. And that option looks at a way to gain beach improvements while simplifying some of the construction for the North Shore Water Reclamation District. This is an illustration of the base option that was developed. You'll see there's a color scheme on here. The yellow construction items is new structures to be placed in the water. That would be the responsibility of the park district. The green items are items that potentially would be the responsibility of the North Shore Water Reclamation District by virtue of their ownership of some of the structures and the land around the pumping station. Let's talk about these improvements starting from south to north. So first, at the south end, we are proposing to expand the South Stone Breakwater by approximately 105 feet. This expansion will result in a much smaller gap between the two breakwaters, north and south of that opening. That in turn will change the wave dynamics inside of that beach cell, and you will see more sand forming on the south side of the cell and the west side to a certain extent. Moving on to the North Shore Water Reclamation District Bluff Pumping Station facility, and this is the green improvements. This would be an improvement of the stone revetment that faces that's parallel to the parking lot in this area here. So for 125 feet, this stone revetment would be buttressed with additional stone to address pavement damages and flooding that occurs periodically in that area. The other green area that you see, which is located right here, is the existing steel groin, which is failing. It's corroded, has holes in it, it's somewhat unsafe to be near it, and it doesn't do a very good job of wave management. So this would be essentially buttressing and enveloping that steel in armor stone. And the stones would be on the order of 3 feet in diameter, 3.5 feet in diameter or so. So this green construction has the potential to be funded by the North Shore Water Reclamation District. And the Park District is in early discussions with them to discuss these potential improvements and the potential for the district of funding those particular items. Next is the south cell in the central beach, which is located here. In this area, the south breakwater will be expanded by 90 feet, and the north breakwater will be expanded by about 15 feet, reducing the gap to about 80 feet. And that reduction of the gap will cause a certain amount of wave action to reflect out into deep water as opposed to coming onto the beach. And the amount of wave energy that gets into the beach will be significantly reduced. As a result, the erosion that we're seeing along the beach, including erosion of clay that we've shown in pictures, would be significantly addressed by this new configuration. Still within the central beach, but in the north beach cell, located here, there would be an expansion of the breakwater by about 30 feet. And this in turn would cause additional protection for the beach in this area where we see erosion occurring at present by limiting the amount of wave energy that can get in there. The next area is the North Beach or the Dog Beach, which is this area. And this area would receive 65 feet of breakwater expansion on the south side of that cell and a 100-foot new breakwater on the existing steel structure on the north side. And that reduces the gap width to 80 feet between these structures. And again, as a result, the much more wave energy would be reflected offshore as opposed to coming in to this cell. And the amount of energy that gets in here would be reduced, and the ability for beach formation and protection against erosion would be increased in that area. This exhibit is the rendering of the base option without the colors shown, so that you get the impression of the look of this option from an aerial perspective. This slide compares the 2017 beach condition on the top with the rendering of the proposed base option on the bottom, so you can get a sense for the differences between the two. This slide presents an opinion of probable cost to implement the base option. The cost is broken down for each of the beach cells and also further subdivided by the cost of construction, mitigation for lake bottom filling, which is required by the regulatory agencies, permits, engineering and construction administration costs, as well as contingencies that reflect the early stage nature of this estimate. So I'll go through each of the beach cells one by one and just list the overall cost for each. The South Beach is $1,072,000. The Central Beach construction is $1,279,300. The North Beach is $3,931,000. So the total cost for this entire option would be $3,931,000. The portion of that cost that is potentially attributable to the North Shore Water Reclamation District, which are the areas shown in green, would be $795,000. So the rough cost in total for the Park District for this base option would be approximately $3.2 million. This slide illustrates the expanded base option. In most respects, it's identical to the base option that we just discussed. So all of those features would be constructed. In addition, this option provides two elements that are shown in red. The first is a reconstruction of the existing breakwater in this area. This particular breakwater is a little thin and relatively low, and as a result, wave overtopping regularly causes erosion in this area of the beach, which is a very popular area. So this would be buttressed with additional stone, and therefore the wave action would be reflected and this erosion problem would be resolved. The second aspect of the expanded base option is this pier structure in this area, shown in red. So instead of simply a stone buttress on the existing steel, there would be a concrete pier constructed in this area with a circular feature at its east end. There would be railings, fishing features. There would be relatively deep water out at the end of this pier, and the view is pretty much unobstructed in all directions. This slide is the expanded base option with the colors removed, so you can see from a perspective view what this option would look like. This is also the expanded base option, showing a comparison with the top being the existing condition and the bottom being the proposed condition for the expanded base option. This is a detailed opinion of probable cost for the expanded base option. It's very similar to the base option with the exception that the stone buttress in this area would add $267,800 to the project, and this concrete and steel pier would add $390,200 to the cost, for a total additional cost of $658,000 for the expanded base option. A third option was investigated that looks to collaborate with a future planned construction project that the North Shore Water Reclamation District is considering undertaking, and taking advantage of the construction materials that would be produced by their project. That project would include the construction of a reservoir under this area of the beach shown in red. It would be a buried reservoir excavated very deep into the ground, and then when the reservoir is completed, the sand would be replaced on top, so you wouldn't even see it was there. The boat storage facilities would be removed and reconstructed by them. And the idea was that rather than having them excavate all this fill and have to truck it through the streets to landfills or to other construction sites, that material would be beneficially reused in this yellow area, which would be a new lake fill in Lake Michigan. And this yellow area could then be turned into expanded parkland with a variety of different potential surface features such as promenades, walkways, seating areas, vegetated areas, etc. This is a rendering of the Lakeville Expansion and one potential surface treatment. There is no surface treatment that has been settled in on. This is really just a hypothetical one. There's a whole variety of ways that this could be done. But essentially, we would be creating new space in the lake in this area for the park to be expanded, and we would create some type of connections from the north beaches to the south beaches, and this area would be vegetated and have some landscape features on it. These are two versions of cross-section views of the Lakeville expansion with different types of vegetation. The upper one shows more tall tree approach. The lower one shows more low shrubs type of approach. And there's pedestrian walkways and promenades and such on here. So the existing cross-section looks something like this. So all of this area in here would be fill to create this new space. And same thing down in this one. The existing shoreline is here. This area is the water line comes right up to here on both of these. So you can see there's a significant additional land surface. This slide shows a comparison of the existing and the Lakeville expansion option so that you can get a perspective of the differences. And the Lakeville expansion option also includes the base option, breakwater structures. So the expansion again is down in this area right here. And you can see the different connection that would occur now, whereas presently the connection is through this parking lot. This slide summarizes the incremental opinion of probable cost to implement this Lakeville option. This does not include the costs associated with the base option features on the beach cells north and south of us. It simply focuses in on this landfill aspect of the project. The total cost of this addition is $1.47 million. Now that cost presumes that we would have no cost for earth fill portions of the fill in the lake, as that material would be given free from the reservoir excavation. It also presumes that there's a credit of $249,000 because the North Shore Water Reclamation District would not have to construct the revetment construction that's part of the base option in this location. So that savings would apply to the project presumably. There's also the possibility that the cost for the district to excavate this reservoir and dispose of that fill could be a lot more expensive than if they can simply provide the fill to the site. So there's a possibility that there could be some additional deductions. But overall, we would anticipate that to build this feature, this Lakeville feature, would cost about $1.5 million, and perhaps the trade-off for doing the reservoir includes about a 15% reduction in cost in this number. So this option was investigated with the thinking that perhaps there was a win-win situation here where some additional park could be constructed at a trade for using the fill from this site. But as it turns out, we can only use so much of that fill because any of the fill below the water has to be a crushed stone. So only so much of this fill is compatible with this expansion in this particular location. As such, for this feature to be built, the community would have to decide that the benefits of this feature warrant the additional cost, significant cost to build this option. One additional item that we looked at includes the offshore island breakwater that was included in the master plan. As many of the features discussed and analyzed for this project was an outgrowth of the master plan. So we wanted to address this offshore island feature since we haven't talked about that yet. So we looked at the feasibility of this island breakwater concept, and we concluded that first of all, it's located far enough offshore that it likely would not be permittable to the state and federal agencies. They're not allowing new offshore structures that far out that can have a significant influence on the littoral drift. And this structure would have a significant influence. As well, it's far enough offshore so that a wave action approaching from the northwest would have direct access into the beach area behind this structure. And the shadowing effect of this structure would be limited to certain areas. However, the currents would be continuing behind this structure. So it's just not a very efficient structure to protect this beach area, which is a primary focus of solving the problems back here. As well, this island is really not conducive for people to access it. These stones would be very large to resist the wave energy out in that deep of water, and would be very dangerous for people to climb on that. So this is just another feature that we evaluated and are commenting on because it did show up in the master plan. Before closing out the presentation, there are a number of questions that came up during the meeting. I'd like to try to address these. First question, can we do a project in stages or one breakwater at a time? And the answer to this is that yes, it could be staged into different phases. And in all likelihood, it would be done by beach cells. So you probably wouldn't want to do a portion of one of the beach cells within a given area, as some of the structures work in combination to create the given effect and protection. What are the drawbacks if it's staged? There would be additional cost due to dual mobilizations. There would be less efficiency from the contractors. The schedule would be longer if you summed up two different periods of time due to the mobilization cost, and more potential for perhaps weather downtime when you extend the period of time. There would also be construction disruptions to beach activities that would extend over several periods. And of course, the construction can only be done during good weather on the lake, which to a certain extent coincides with beach weather. So there would have to be consideration given to the amount of disruption in a multiple phase approach compared to a single or say two-stage type of approach. So this would require a significant discussion, consideration of available funding, and some of these issues. Next question is, what would be the impact on the road heading down to the bluff due to construction? And so the answer is that it wouldn't necessarily have to be done from land using the road. There are questions about can the road sustain construction traffic, and we would have to defer to the village engineer on that question. It bears noting that it does usually pay to have as much competition as you can. There's very few contractors that do this type of work on the lake, so it helps to have competitors who can do it from land. There's a few of those also that have experience, but by inviting all different types of contractors, you're likely to have a better competition and better bids. So this approach would need to be evaluated. in terms of the ability of the road to handle stress. If the road can handle the stress, would repair costs justify going that route economically? And now what are some of the schedule implications? And with input from the park district and the village engineer, as well as funding considerations, that decision would be made based on those items. Next question, would there be an impact on village streets? And the answer here is potentially, and we would defer to the village engineer on this. They're very close to the conditions of the streets, the equipment brought in by truck. The trucks would be such that they spread out the load. They have larger wheels, but of course, some of the city streets are relatively small here, so the village engineer would have to weigh in on that issue to see what the potential downside is for doing it from land compared to the competitive environment of bidding a project like this and all the other issues that I've mentioned. Next question, is there a big cost difference between barge or land? And this really depends on market conditions. Both methods have proven they can win bid competitions in the North Shore. And there are advantages for each. A waterborne contractor has to deal with weather on a more critical basis because they have to anticipate more readily. It's harder to mobilize from their home bases during bad weather conditions. It also depends where the stone is coming from. The stone is coming from Wisconsin quarries, and usually there's a pretty fair competitive situation in terms of water versus land transportation of materials. The ability to bid both ways, as I indicate, can create more competition. So this is kind of a wild card in that with more competition, you tend to have the chance for better pricing. There just aren't that many contractors that work on the water as well as on land, so it really pays to be able to go both ways, but certainly does not have to be done that way. And if there's significant reasons such as traffic in the streets and such, potential street damages, it certainly could be done in the method that the village sees best fit for the community. Next question, how will the pier hold up in weather conditions and how will it be constructed? The pier will be designed for a 100-year lake event and also for overload conditions. So you really want any structure such as this to be designed to withstand the stress of a coastal environment. So it'll be done properly, and there are methods for analyzing the forces of wave attack on various approaches. Proper materials would be used and modern design standards. The structure as concepted in the presentation was a steel cell, so it has vertical steel walls on both sides forming a pier filled with crushed stone, would have some internal structural steel elements that tie it together, as well as a structural concrete slab on top that would be tied in with the steel. There's tried and true ways of doing this. The reason that concept was put together was because it gets people closer to the water as opposed to a pier on top of stone. As well, the cost of stone is really high these days, so that it doesn't necessarily mean if you put a pier on top of a stone breakwater, for example, that would be a less expensive approach. And it also does make for more difficult to get close to the water for fishing and such. And there's also the possibility that the structure could be a composite between a stone-based foundation with a concrete promenade on top, and then out at the end and towards the deeper water, it could be a steel pier-like structure. So those decisions would be made during preliminary design prior to putting bid documents together, with input from many fronts in the village and park district before deciding on the final configuration. Next question: are there less expensive options that we may consider? And the answer there is possibly. The preliminary design assessment that we've done so far with some community input and from the obviously the park district is not necessarily the final option. So before going into bidding documents, there would still need to be lots of discussions in terms of potential refinements to the design. So that would be determined by the park district before things move towards the bid documents. The next and final question is, how much more expensive would it be if only one phase is done each year? And which phase should be done first? And this really depends on the bidding climate. Like I indicated, there are a limited number of bidders that work on these types of structures. So the bidding climate at the time of bidding will help determine what the cost is going to be. Anytime you stage a project, it requires multiple mobilizations, which adds cost, and perhaps in the 5 to 10% range of the total cost. Larger project could draw more bidders. Larger projects would be of more interest to some of the larger waterborne contractors that tend to work on big public projects, as opposed to a smaller one. So you never really know. It depends on how busy everybody is at the time of the bidding. But that's a possibility that could bring the cost down somewhat. Because some of the smaller contractors, they're able to have higher prices sometimes if there's very few bidders on the project, just because of less competition. And there, of course, there's also the issue of construction disruption over several years, and impacts on the beach-going public during the beach season. The first phase really would require input from the park district and the village. It's really premature for me to conclude which phase would go first, although I suspect the first phase would be targeted to resolve those portions of the beach with the greatest degree of problems. And we touched upon most of those problems during the course of the presentation, so you can probably have a pretty good sense of where the bigger problems are. And then there's got to be a balance between addressing the problems versus construction disruption and the aesthetic aspects of the project. And those are all the questions that we had so far. And that is the end of the presentation at this time.